3 days. That's all it took to shatter the illusion of love, to twist devotion into betrayal, and transform a man of God into a killer. In the quiet town of Beaumont, Texas, a place where everyone knows your name, where the courthouse and the church sit just a block apart, and where secrets are rarely kept for long, a tragedy unfolded that no one saw coming. On the morning of March 4, 2023, a frantic 911 call came from a white two-story house tucked behind Luke's Chapel. The voice on the other end belonged to 44-year-old preacher Matthew Keene, once a man revered from the pulpit, now barely coherent through gasping breaths and trembling confessions. His words: "I think I killed her, oh my God, I think I killed my wife." That wife was 42-year-old Judge Danielle Myers, a celebrated legal mind, a trailblazer in the Texas judicial system, and, up until 72 hours prior, a bride glowing with happiness and newlywed promise. To the world, theirs had been a love story that defied convention, a priest who left the collar behind for the woman he called his soulmate. Whispers of scandal followed them, sure, but so did admiration. People said it was romantic, brave, beautiful. But behind closed doors, something darker was festering. Something violent. Something fatal. When law enforcement arrived at the scene, they expected chaos. What they found was haunting silence. Danielle's body was discovered in the master bedroom, lying still, eyes open, with a single blow to her head and a trail of blood leading to the bathroom floor. She had been dressed in her nightgown, as if she had never even seen it coming. Standing just feet away, drenched in blood, was Matthew, dazed, murmuring scripture under his breath, holding a framed wedding photo in his hands. What went so wrong? How does a man of faith, a man sworn to serve both God and love, cross the line into violence? And what secret was so devastating, so soul-shattering, that it turned a honeymoon into a homicide? Because as investigators dug into the timeline, a shocking revelation emerged: Danielle had been hiding something. A secret affair. One she never intended to confess. But someone, somehow, had told him. And 3 days after saying, "I do," Matthew Keene said, "I'm done." This is the story of betrayal. Of buried pasts. Of broken vows. And of a man who believed he was doing God's will, even as he committed an unholy act. This is the true crime story of the Texas priest, who murdered his judge wife. Before the blood, before the betrayal, before the nation knew their names, there were just two people. Two complicated people, searching for redemption in very different ways. Preacher Matthew Keene was born and raised in San Angelo, Texas. The only child of deeply religious parents, he grew up under the weight of high expectations and the shadow of a stern, God-fearing preacher. His mother, sweet but passive, often faded into the background, her voice drowned out by his preacher's pulpit-like pronouncements over the dinner table. From a young age, Matthew learned the language of obedience, faith, and silence. By age 17, he had already declared his desire to enter the seminary. He was praised as a prodigy, brilliant, soft-spoken, devout. But behind that angelic exterior, there was always something fragile in Matthew. Something easily bruised. He struggled with anxiety, with obsessive self-discipline, and a need for validation that bordered on desperate. He would confess small sins he hadn't even committed, just to prove his own devotion. By 30, preacher Matthew Keene had become the leading pastor at Luke's Chapel in Beaumont, a close-knit community where the pews were always full, and the choir sang just a little louder when he walked in. He was adored. But behind the sermons and smiles, he was lonely. Isolated. Chained to the very discipline that had won him so much admiration. She was the complete opposite of Matthew in almost every way. Raised in Houston by a single mother and a string of rotating preacher figures, Danielle was street-smart, ambitious, and fiercely independent. She put herself through law school, then climbed her way into the district court system faster than most believed possible. At 42, she was known for being both sharp and unshakable on the bench. She handed down harsh sentences, but often visited the families of victims in her free time. She had layers, and people loved her for it. Danielle had been married once before. A short, explosive marriage in her 20s that ended with restraining orders and police reports. She had 2 teenage children from that relationship, Emily, age 16, and Jordan, age 14, both of whom were living with her full-time. She never remarried, never seriously dated. Work was her focus, until the day she met Matthew. It started, strangely enough, at a funeral. Danielle had attended the service of a retired judge, a colleague and mentor. Matthew was officiating. He didn't recognize her at first, not with her dark sunglasses and stony expression. But afterward, when she approached to thank him, something clicked. She told him his words had moved her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. They talked. And talked. And kept talking. Over the next 6 months, they met regularly, under the pretense of spiritual counseling. But it quickly evolved into something else. A kind of electric connection neither had expected. Danielle was bold, confident, even flirtatious, everything Matthew wasn't. And he? He was stable, thoughtful, and gentle, everything she felt she needed. To some, the pairing was odd. A priest and a judge. But to them, it felt like fate. And so began one of the most scandalous love affairs in the town's recent memory. Matthew had never had a serious romantic relationship. His vows of celibacy had been unbroken, at least, officially. But his feelings for Danielle began to erode that wall. He started missing evening services, canceling confessions, disappearing on church retreats. Before we dive deeper into this intense, emotional case, we want to remind you, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We bring you gripping true crime stories, deep dives, and unsolved mysteries every week. You won't want to miss a single episode. Like this video if you're as captivated by this case as we are, and leave a comment below with your thoughts, we'd love to hear from you. Now, let's get back to the chilling details of this unbelievable story. Stay with us. Rumors began to swirl. Parishioners whispered about a woman who visited him late at night, always parking around the back. Eventually, the truth came out. Matthew stepped down from his position at Luke's. Danielle, though pressured by colleagues and media, stood by him. In a public statement, she said, "Love doesn't always come in the way you expect it. But when it does, you follow it. No matter what it costs." They were married on March 1, 2023, in a small, private ceremony in Austin. No press. No fanfare. Just close friends, her kids, and a few scattered family members. The ceremony was quiet, intimate. Photos later surfaced, Danielle in a sleek white gown, Matthew in a black tux, smiling, holding her hand like a man who'd finally been granted permission to feel. But even in the photos, if you looked closely, there was something off in his eyes. Because while Danielle glowed with the confidence of a woman in control, Matthew looked stiff. Nervous. As though he already knew something was wrong. And in truth, he did. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Matthew had started noticing things. Danielle was distant. Distracted. Texting more than usual. Taking calls in another room. And twice, just twice, but enough to plant a seed. He saw a name pop up on her phone, C. Dawson. When he asked, she brushed it off. An attorney, she said. Old friend from law school. But it didn't sit right with him. He tried to ignore it. Prayed about it. Told himself it was paranoia. But the night before the wedding, Matthew did something he'd never done before. He read her journal. And what he found would break something in him. Passages describing doubts about the marriage, feelings of obligation rather than passion, and worst of all, thinly veiled mentions of another man. "See," she wrote, "makes me feel alive again. But Matthew is the safe choice. The stable one. The one I can control. That last line would replay in Matthew's head for days. Still, he went through with it. Why? No one knows for sure. Maybe denial. Maybe hope. Maybe something darker, the kind of quiet rage that builds slowly, silently, and waits for the right moment to explode. And that moment was coming. Because 3 days into their marriage, a message appeared on Danielle's phone. A message she forgot to delete. Matthew read it. And everything changed. It was just after 6:45 a.m. on the morning of March 4, 2023, when a chilling call came through to Beaumont Police Dispatch. The voice on the line was breathless. Panicked. But eerily calm beneath the hysteria. Dispatcher, Beaumont 911, what's your emergency? Caller, heavy breathing, I think I killed her. Oh my God. I think I killed my wife. There was a pause. Then a sob. Then a name. Matthew Keene. My name is Preacher, I mean, Matthew. I didn't mean to, I swear to God, I didn't. Officers were dispatched immediately to 2913, Laurelwood Drive, a quiet, upscale cul-de-sac just 3 blocks from Luke's Chapel. Neighbors had never once called in a noise complaint from the address. There were no previous incidents. No signs of domestic violence. The home was new, the lawn freshly manicured, the porch still decorated with, just married, streamers and flower petals from 3 nights earlier. But inside, it was a different story. Lead Detective Karen Hollis was the first to enter the bedroom. What she saw was, in her words, not a scene of passion. Not a fight gone wrong. It was quiet. Methodical. Almost, clinical. Danielle Myers was found lying on the floor, partially on her side. There was blood, a lot of it, pooled beneath her skull and smeared across the doorframe, suggesting blunt force trauma. She had been struck with a glass award plaque from the bookshelf, Judge of the Year, honor she'd received just 6 months earlier. Irony, painted in crimson. She had no defensive wounds. No scratches, no bruises on her arms. Authorities believe she was either asleep or caught entirely by surprise. She was still wearing her nightgown, and her wedding ring, a simple platinum band, was stained with blood. Matthew Keene was found sitting on the edge of the bed, rocking slowly. His hands were covered in blood, and he was holding a wedding photo, the frame cracked from the impact when he'd thrown it against the wall earlier. The photo showed them smiling, eyes bright with promise. That promise now lay dead at his feet. Detective Hollis approached slowly, hand on her holster. Matthew, she said softly, what happened? He looked up. Eyes red, empty. I found the message, he whispered. She lied to me. Lied to God. He was taken into custody without resistance. The Harris County Medical Examiner's Office ruled cause of death as blunt force trauma to the skull, resulting in a fatal brain hemorrhage. The strike had fractured her parietal bone, and blood had pooled rapidly inside her cranial cavity. Death would have been nearly instantaneous. Toxicology came back clean. No alcohol. No sedatives. No trace of a struggle. Danielle's phone, recovered from the master bathroom floor, was the key to unraveling motive. At 2:12 a.m., just hours before her death, she had received a message from a contact saved as C. Dawson. The message read, "Still can't believe you actually went through with it. When are you telling him the truth?" Another message came shortly after, "You know I'll wait for you, Danielle. But I deserve more than this. We both do." The sender, later identified as Christopher Dawson, was a fellow judge and longtime friend from her days at University of Texas Law. Married, 2 kids. A man with a clean public image, and a very private affair. Authorities discovered that Danielle and Christopher had been romantically involved for over a year. Their affair began during a legal ethics summit in Dallas, long before Matthew and Danielle became serious. In one of Danielle's locked journal entries, accessed with a passcode her daughter Emily later provided, she wrote, "Chris gets me. He challenges me. He doesn't worship me like Matthew does, and that's why it works. But Matthew? Matthew is a safe bet. He'll never leave me. He'll forgive anything." Matthew was interrogated within hours of his or the footage, later released to the media, would spark national fascination. In a sterile gray room at the Beaumont Police Department, Matthew sat hunched in a chair, silent for nearly 20 minutes. Then he spoke. "She stood there, right there in front of me, and told me she loved me. Every day. Every night. I gave up everything for her. I gave up God for her. And she was sleeping with another man the whole time." Detective Hollis leaned forward. "Is that why you hit her?" Matthew shook his head. "No. I hit her, because she laughed." "What do you mean?" "When I asked her about the message, she smiled. She said, 'I never loved you, Matthew. I just needed a man who would say yes.' And then she laughed. I saw red. And then it all went black." News of the murder hit the local stations by noon. By 6 p.m., it was national. Beloved Texas judge killed by ex-priest husband, 3 days into marriage, the honeymoon killer, betrayal, religion, and blood in Beaumont, people couldn't get enough. The scandal had everything: religion, law, sex, betrayal, and a man of faith whose hands were now stained with sin. Parishioners from Luke's were divided. Some claimed Matthew had been driven mad by heartbreak. Others called him a wolf in priest's clothing. One longtime churchgoer was quoted saying, "He always looked so calm. But I think he was just hiding how broken he really was." Danielle's colleagues in the courthouse mourned her in waves. A memorial was held the following week, with over 400 people in attendance, including her children, who sat silently in the front row, staring at the coffin as though it were a dream. Despite his confession, the case was far from over. Matthew's defense team immediately hinted at temporary insanity and emotional trauma. They argued he had suffered a psychological break triggered by emotional betrayal and religious crisis. The court ordered a full psychiatric evaluation. Investigators continued gathering evidence, messages, journal entries, digital correspondence between Danielle and Christopher Dawson. Meanwhile, Dawson refused to speak publicly. He retained a lawyer and issued a one-line statement, "My heart breaks for Danielle's family. I will not be answering questions at this time." Behind closed doors, whispers of professional misconduct and judicial ethics violations began to swirl. But legally, Dawson was never charged. He was never even called as a formal witness. Because the focus remained on one man. One husband. One killer. Matthew Keene. The news cycle had barely cooled when the next headline dropped: former priest Matthew Keene charged with first-degree murder of Judge Danielle Myers. Within 48 hours of Danielle's death, Matthew Keene was officially charged with first-degree murder under Texas Penal Code Section 19.02. Prosecutors argued the act was premeditated, citing the weapon, a heavy glass object, and a lack of struggle, suggesting Danielle was struck deliberately, not in the heat of a chaotic altercation. But the defense had a different narrative. One that would soon divide the public, the courtroom, and even the victim's family. Matthew Keene was denied bail. The judge ruled him a potential flight risk and a man with a demonstrated psychological break. He was transferred from the Beaumont City Jail to the Jefferson County Detention Center, placed on suicide watch, and kept in protective custody due to threats made against him from other inmates and public protesters. Outside the courthouse, the air was electric. Reporters camped out for hours, cameras aimed at the jail entrance, hoping to catch even a glimpse of the murdering protesters held signs reading, "Justice for Danielle. Protect Black women. Sin in the cloth." But not everyone was screaming for blood. Some were whispering about mercy. While many saw Matthew as a monster who'd murdered his wife in cold blood, others, particularly from his former congregation, painted a different picture. They spoke of a soft-spoken man, a servant of God, who had been betrayed, humiliated, and emotionally devastated. Local radio shows were flooded with callers debating whether Matthew was a victim of manipulation or just a man trying to hide behind a collar. One caller said, "He was used. He gave everything up for her. His faith. His future. And she lied to him from the altar. He snapped. I don't condone it, but I understand it." That phrase, "I understand it," became a controversial slogan in town. The trial was scheduled to begin in early August 2023, but pre-trial hearings kicked off by April. Leading the prosecution was District Attorney Lila Guerra, a seasoned, sharp-tongued prosecutor with a reputation for zero tolerance on domestic violence. She opened her argument with a chilling declaration: this was not a crime of passion. It was a calculated killing committed by a man who couldn't handle not being the center of a woman's world. The prosecution laid out a clear strategy, emphasized the lack of struggle. Focus on the deliberate use of a heavy weapon. Undermine the insanity plea by showing Matthew's calmness post-murder, especially his decision to sit beside the body for over 2 hours before calling 911. They presented forensic evidence, blood spatter patterns indicating Danielle was likely sitting or lying down when struck. The fractured edge of the glass award, which matched the wound pattern exactly. Matthew's fingerprints alone on the object. Then came the journal entries. Danielle's own words, loving letters to Christopher Dawson, her affair partner. The most damning of all read, "I don't want to break Matthew's heart. But I don't want to live a lie either. He's gentle, too gentle. I need more than sermons and Sunday dinners." Matthew's defense attorney, Andrew Callahan, took a drastically different approach. His opening line during the pre-trial was delivered like a dagger: "This is not the story of a murder. This is the story of a man who was destroyed by betrayal, by a woman he trusted with his soul." Callahan leaned hard on Matthew's religious background. He painted Matthew as a deeply faithful man, emotionally vulnerable after leaving the priesthood, something he'd done only for Danielle. He argued, Matthew suffered a psychological snap, worsened by spiritual disorientation. The murder lacked planning, it happened moments after reading the texts. Matthew was not criminally insane, but deeply traumatized and mentally overwhelmed. The defense's psychological expert testified that Matthew displayed signs of reactive psychosis, a short-term mental break triggered by intense emotional trauma. Though Christopher Dawson was never charged, his name dominated headlines. The media relentlessly pursued him, parking outside his home, interviewing neighbors, former clerks, even his children's teachers. Some questioned why he hadn't warned Danielle about the danger of deception. Others wanted him charged with conspiracy or moral liability. One particularly controversial op-ed in the Houston Chronicle read, "Had Dawson told the truth, Danielle might still be alive. There is blood on his hands, if not legally, then morally." The scandal nearly cost Dawson his judgeship. The Texas State Commission on Judicial Conduct launched an ethics investigation. Dawson stepped down voluntarily, citing concern for his family's safety and privacy. Then came a bombshell tweet 2 weeks before trial. The prosecution submitted into evidence a previously undisclosed email found in Danielle's laptop trash folder. The email was addressed to a family law attorney in Houston. The subject line: "Filing for annulment." The message read, "I can't go through with this marriage. I made a mistake. I want out. I'm afraid of how he'll react. He's intense. Very intense. Please advise." It had been written the day before the murder. But it was never sent. Prosecutors seized on this as evidence of Danielle's intent to leave, further supporting the theory of motive and premeditation. The defense, however, argued the unsent email was a ghost thought, never acted upon, never spoken. The courtroom was visibly shaken. Danielle's sister sobbed openly in the gallery. Reporters tweeted in real time. The judge had to call a recess due to emotional disturbance in the audience. As the trial drew near, the lines were drawn. Two Americas seemed to emerge: those who saw Danielle as a confident, career-driven woman, wronged and silenced in the most violent way possible. Those who saw Matthew as a broken man, manipulated and discarded, who lost control when the person he loved the most destroyed his very sense of identity. And in the middle, there was the truth, messy, painful, unrelenting. The final act would determine whether Matthew Keene was a cold-blooded killer, or a man whose heart, faith, and mind were all shattered, in a single night. The trial of Matthew Keene was unlike anything the state of Texas had seen in years. A former priest turned murder suspect. A beloved judge bludgeoned just days after their wedding. The perfect storm of faith, betrayal, and fatal consequence had now reached its boiling point inside a crowded courtroom. On the morning of July 24, 2023, the Harris County Courthouse was surrounded by reporters, true crime podcasters, curious locals, and even protesters. Inside, tension filled every inch of the wood-paneled courtroom. The stakes were monumental, not only for Matthew Keene's future, but for the public's desperate thirst for justice in the death of Judge Danielle Rucker. As court proceedings began, 12 jurors filed in, a mixed group of men and women who would carry the burden of deciding Matthew's fate. On one side of the courtroom sat Danielle's grieving family, her preacher stiff and unreadable, her sister visibly distraught. On the other side sat Matthew's mother, the only family member of his to appear in court, quietly clutching a Bible and refusing to meet anyone's gaze. The state began with a calculated, chilling opening. Prosecutors framed Matthew not as a man who lost control, but as someone who acted with lethal clarity. A man driven by ego and the inability to tolerate betrayal, a betrayal he discovered only hours before taking Danielle's life. But the defense had a different story to tell. They painted Matthew as a broken soul, a man who had left his spiritual calling for love, only to be shattered by a devastating discovery. They weren't asking the jury to see Matthew as innocent, they were asking them to see him as human. Flawed. Wounded. Reacting in a moment of unbearable emotional collapse. What followed over the next 2 weeks was a courtroom saga that peeled back every layer of Matthew and Danielle's short, volatile union. Testimonies began with law enforcement. The lead detective on the case described the crime scene almost too perfect in its silence. There had been no struggle. No fight. Just a single, fatal blow to Danielle's head with a glass award, a personalized gift that read, "Pillar of Justice." Jurors were shown photographs of the body, carefully, respectfully, but the emotional impact was immediate. Even seasoned court personnel found themselves shaken. The medical examiner confirmed the brutality, a precise, forceful strike to the left temple. Death would have been near instantaneous. There were no signs of defensive wounds. No bruising. Just one clean, deliberate hit. But the most damning evidence came not from blood or bone, but from data. A forensic digital investigator presented a timeline built from Danielle's phone records. Just minutes before the murder, Matthew had accessed her phone and viewed a string of messages exchanged between Danielle and her former colleague, Judge Christopher Dawson. The texts left little to interpretation, affectionate, romantic, and suggesting that their emotional entanglement had never truly ended. From the moment those messages were read, the clock began ticking. Danielle was dead less than 15 minutes later. The defense fought back hard in the second week, relying on a team of psychologists and spiritual advisors who testified to Matthew's mental decline in the months leading up to the wedding. Former colleagues from the church described a man who had lost his sense of purpose, who had wandered in emotional darkness long before Danielle came into his life. And then came the moment that silenced the room, when Matthew Keene himself took the stand. He appeared gaunt, exhausted, and visibly aged. His voice was low, at times barely audible. He described falling in love with Danielle as a rescue, a chance to build something new outside the cloistered life he had once known. But that night, upon discovering the truth, he claimed something inside him broke. He described the moment of the murder not as a decision, but as a blackout. A lapse in reality. One moment, Danielle was talking to him. The next, she was gone. It was a powerful moment. But then, the prosecution dropped their final card. In a shocking twist, a previously unheard voicemail was introduced into evidence. It had been left by Danielle's close friend and fellow judge just hours before her death. In it, Danielle admitted she was planning to confront Matthew that night, to confess the affair, and possibly walk away from the marriage altogether. She had feared Matthew's reaction. She had even said she didn't feel safe. The courtroom was frozen in time. That voicemail reframed everything. This wasn't just a moment of emotional collapse. Danielle had been afraid. And she hadn't survived the night. Closing arguments brought the battle to a boiling point. Prosecutors reminded the jury of the facts: one fatal strike, no signs of struggle, a weapon selected deliberately. They argued that Matthew's sense of betrayal had turned to rage, and in that rage, he made a conscious, irreversible decision. The defense begged for understanding, not acquittal, but compassion. They argued that this wasn't a man of violence, but a man undone by grief, abandoned by the world he gave up everything for. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. Every hour felt like a century to those waiting. Finally, as the sun dipped low on August 11, 2023, the jury returned. Guilty. But not of murder. Matthew Keene was convicted of voluntary manslaughter, a charge that acknowledged the emotional provocation of the crime, but stopped short of declaring it premeditated. The sentence, 25 years in state prison, with parole eligibility after 18. For Danielle's family, it was a mixed verdict. There was justice, but not full closure. Some felt it wasn't enough. Others simply wept, knowing that no amount of years behind bars could ever bring her back. Outside the courthouse, the public reaction was just as divided. Some saw Matthew as a cold-blooded killer hiding behind priestly robes. Others saw him as another casualty in a tragic love story that spiraled out of control. As for Matthew Keene, he now resides in the Allred Unit Prison Facility, where he reportedly spends his time in the chapel, organizing scripture readings for other inmates. In a rare interview, he was asked what he would say to Danielle, if he could speak to her again. His answer was quiet. "I'm sorry. Not just for what I did, but for not being the man you needed me to be." The courtroom drama had ended, but the emotional scars left behind would linger for generations to come. The trial was over. The verdict had been handed down. But the echoes of Matthew Keene's crime, and the tragic death of Judge Danielle Rucker, reverberated far beyond the courtroom walls. It was a case that seemed to blur the lines between faith, justice, and human frailty. It was a story of a man consumed by emotional turmoil, a woman who trusted him with her life, and a brutal act that would change everything. Matthew Keene now resides in the Allred Unit, a medium-security prison in Iowa Park, Texas. He spends most of his days in the prison chapel, often described by fellow inmates as a quiet man with a tortured soul. He leads a Bible study group for those seeking spiritual guidance, and in interviews, he claims that his faith is the only thing keeping him from completely unraveling. Despite his remorse, he never directly answers questions about whether he believes he should have received a harsher sentence. At night, when the prison quiets down, Matthew is said to reflect on his pot. He sometimes speaks about Danielle, but only in the vaguest terms. When asked in a recent interview about his biggest regret, his voice cracked. "Not walking away. Not turning the other way. If I had just done that, she'd still be here, and I'd be a different person." Outside the prison walls, his mother, Eleanor Keene, continues to fight for her son. She petitions for his release, speaking in public forums and even writing letters to the governor of Texas. She speaks of him as a broken man, one who made a horrific mistake but is not beyond redemption. Still, for those who knew Matthew before the crime, they struggle to reconcile the man they knew with the man who could end a life so suddenly. For Danielle's family, the wound has never fully healed. Her preacher, James Rucker, has remained largely out of the public eye since the trial, while her sister, Monique Myers, became a vocal advocate for women in abusive or controlling relationships. Monique frequently appears at local shelters, speaking to women who find themselves in situations that echo Danielle's seemingly perfect relationships, until the facade begins to crack. Monique often remembers the warning signs Danielle had ignored. The subtle possessiveness. The growing isolation from her friends. The mounting pressure that Matthew had placed on her, all things that, in hindsight, should have raised red flags. But, Monique has said time and again, no one could have predicted the darkness that overtook him. Danielle's loss remains a burden on her family. They gather every year on the anniversary of her death, not just to mourn but to renew their commitment to the causes she championed during her short life. As a judge, Danielle had fought tirelessly for justice, fairness, and equality. Her work with the local community remained her passion, and her family keeps her legacy alive by continuing her charity work. The case of Matthew Keene had a profound impact on both the legal system and the community. The trial brought to light questions of emotional trauma, mental health, and the capacity for people to commit violent acts under extreme emotional stress. Legal experts noted that the conviction for voluntary manslaughter, instead of murder, sparked debates over whether the justice system was too lenient when it came to crimes of passion. Some believed that Matthew's actions had been an expression of cold-blooded rage, while others argued that the verdict represented an understanding of the fragility of human emotions. Communities in Texas, particularly those who had known Matthew as a priest, struggled to reconcile the man they had once trusted with the violence he had committed. Some in the congregation argued that the church failed Matthew, that his spiritual crisis had been ignored for far too long, leading to the breakdown of his psyche. Others believed the crime to be a symptom of toxic masculinity, where power dynamics in relationships turned deadly. Locally, the case forced many to question how vulnerable women could be in seemingly stable relationships. Domestic violence awareness campaigns gained traction in the wake of Danielle's death, and several charities now exist that focus on emotional manipulation and coercion in relationships. Danielle's case was not one of physical violence alone, but of emotional control, manipulation, and a man unable to accept rejection. While Matthew Keene's conviction was final, the question of his mental state continues to haunt the case. His defense team claimed he had suffered from acute dissociative psychosis, an argument that resonated with some jurors but not enough to completely absolve him of his actions. Matthew's attorneys have continued to pursue appeals, citing new evidence from psychological experts who believe that Matthew's mental health was more severely impacted than previously understood. A psychiatrist, Dr. Vivian Harwell, has publicly stated that Matthew's emotional breakdown should be seen as a mental health crisis that was ignored by those closest to him. According to Dr. Harwell, Matthew's descent into paranoia and fear had been building for months, a byproduct of deep insecurities compounded by the dissolution of his spiritual life. Some supporters of Matthew believe that his conviction was a miscarriage of justice, that he was a man who snapped under emotional duress, rather than a man driven by malice or intent. But for the victims of this crime, namely, Danielle Rucker's family, these appeals only add another layer of anguish. They argue that mental health should never be an excuse for murder, and that Danielle's life was worth far more than a man's emotional breakdown. As the years pass, the story of Matthew Keene and Danielle Rucker remains one of the most complex and tragic narratives to come out of Texas. Was this a case of a broken man's final descent into madness, or was it the calculated act of a man who had grown tired of being hurt by the woman he loved? Was there any way to foresee that the man who had once worn the cloth of a priest would become the killer who took his wife's life just days after their vows? The lingering question, however, is whether we, as a society, can ever fully understand the depths of human emotion when pushed to its breaking point. Can we ever truly reconcile the fragility of the human heart with the cold, unforgiving reality of justice? Perhaps we never will. But the story will continue to echo, long after the gavel has fallen. Thank you for sticking with us through this incredibly intense story. We pour our hearts into these deep dives, and if you found yourself captivated by the twists and turns in this case, we truly need your support. It only takes a second. Like the video, comment your thoughts, and subscribe if you want to see more. We work hard to bring you the stories that others don't dare to tell, and it's really disheartening when we don't see the engagement we know this channel deserves. If you found this story gripping, don't just leave us hanging, share your thoughts, hit that like button, and subscribe. It helps more than you think. We'll see you next time. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, or you might just miss out on the next big story.